The $1.9 trillion coronavirus aid package passed the House last week. It is head to the Senate. They are now in the Senate, essentially negotiating amongst themselves, really amongst the Democrats. We know that we're not going to get any Republican votes. We're more than likely no Republican votes for this. It is being done through the reconciliation process, so they don't need the Republican votes. We know at this point that there is not going to be the minimum wage has been stripped from the bill. And as such, there's another $64 billion in there. Like, they've already set the number at $1.9 trillion. And they have already figured out that it hits all the thresholds. When the $64 billion figure I'm talking about is what the Congressional Budget Office scored the cost of the $15 minimum wage. That gets taken out. So there's another $64 billion in there. I don't think we're going to know where that goes until the end of this process. 800-page bill. It's constantly in flux until it gets passed. That's, the nature of this. We do know that there have been reports. And have you heard anything else on this, Emma? I know that it was reported out.
Well, it was then confirmed by NBC that basically Joe Biden has agreed to lowering the cutoff threshold for, or the phase out thresholds, I should say, for the $1,400 checks, even though there's more money to play with right now.
I mean, theoretically. And now, so what does that mean? In the House bill and in the prior $1,200 checks and the $600 checks, the phase out for single filers started at $75,000. So if you're an individual, you're filing on yourself, and you're making $75,000 a year, you're getting a $1,400 check. If you're making $76,000 a year, you're making a little bit less. It sort of tapers off. And the taper goes all the way in those in the House bill to $100,000. If you make $100,000, if you make $99,000, you get a smaller check. I don't know what the algorithm was, but it phased out down to zero at 100,000. Instead of that, Biden has, according to NBC, agreed that at $75,000, it starts to taper down, but the taper is steeper, and it ends if you're making $80,000. So if you make $81,000, you may have gotten a diminished $1,400 check under the House bill.
But the point is that also that this is 2019 income for the most part, too, we should say.
Well, it's 2019, or it could be 2020 if you file before this goes out. If you file over the next couple of weeks, correct. And so it is conceivable but nevertheless, in 2019, I mean, this has always been the problem, right? With 2019, if you base it on 2019, obviously, when you get the $1,200 check in March of last year, it made sense to base it on 2019. When you got the $600 check in December, the 2020 is not over. So you really got to, I don't know how else they would fix that, right? I mean, how else would you establish that? So this is not, now I want to make clear here. When we were worried about this before, we were worried they were going to drop from the $75,000 level and they were going to lower that so that the phase outs would start earlier. But the phase outs don't start earlier. They are steeper, and they're just not available to people making over $80,000. Again, 2019 or 2020 if you file. But I don't know how you escape that problem. And it doesn't implicate that problem, because if you made in 2019 $80,000 in 2019, or I guess if you made $95,000 in 2019 or $81,000 in 2019, and you made significantly less, you're you lost your job, I mean, then you're in unemployment and you're not going to get that extra check. But that would have been a problem too if you lost your job at $100,000 last year.
Understood. I mean, the way that you alleviate this exact problem that you're talking about is use the monopoly money that you got from the $15 minimum wage being stripped from the bill to cast a wider net as opposed to tailoring it more. There's no reason to tailor it more, especially now that the $15 minimum wage isn't included.
Right. It's a different cohort of people. But yes, I agree with what you're saying. And we should say the phase out begins for 112,000 for head of the household. That is like if you were a father or mother and you are a single wage earner. That now ends at 100. That now ends at 120,000. So that went up. That went up if you're a single wage earner. And the phase out for joint filers ends at 160. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. So it used to be, I don't know what it is for the head of the household, but it used to be for joint filers, 150 is when the phase out begins, and it used to end at 200,000, and now it ends at 160. So the people who are making between 161 and 200,000 lose out of some measure of a check. Wouldn't have been $1,400. It would have been diminished. People who are single heads of households, it's now phases out at 120. I don't know what it would have been then, maybe 180, 160 in the old bill, but that's what you get. Higher income and earners. And again, you still have this problem of 2019 versus 2020, but high income earners there, less likely to get the $1,400 check. Now, the difference between this $1,400 check and the $1,200 check and the $600 check, however, is that unlike those previous two payments, adult dependents qualify for this round. So 26 million more Americans will be receiving a $1,400 check, up to 26 million Americans that did not receive the $600 check and did not receive the $1,200 check. And that means college students, that means disabled adults, and that means elderly Americans who are adults living in somebody else's household or essentially a dependent.
Right.
And so in that respect, this is a much better situation, because if you are making if you're the head of a household and you're making $112,000 a year, and you've got to pay for either your college children, or maybe your mother, elderly mother, or your elderly grandmother or grandfather, or an adult who is maybe has is a dependent because of some type of disability or something that they can't work, they can't live on their own. You're now getting an extra $1,400 for that person. And so,
yes, that is, but to my point earlier, though, that all would have been true had these thresholds not been lowered for no reason.
Indeed. And Janet Yellen said it best, like, you can target things, but every time you target, you are missing hidden pockets of pain. And the idea that you're going to be that parsimonious for folks at that income level still. And again,
or just like kingmaker-esque, like a lot of what this is too, in my view, is just this kind of arrogant puppeteer element that we see way too much in the Democratic Party. It's paternalistic too. They would rather be able to target things to such a specific degree as opposed to casting a wider net. And yes, this is still a good bill. I mean, the thing that's underrated too is the $3,600 a year child tax credit that's in here as well.
That's right.
That's kind of akin to something that Romney proposed too, but it's still a good thing. And that's going to be included for families with young children. And I think up to 17 years old, you also get a payment as well. It's just not as large, but still very significant. And I wonder what they're going to do with that extra
We'll see. I mean, who knows?
$50+ billion or whatever it is. That's key.
In January, when the $600 checks hit bank accounts, personal spending increased by 2.4%. This is according to the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis. And we're now looking at $1,400 per person. And I imagine with 26 million more people being eligible for that extra $1,400, plus the tax credits that you talked about, this is going to make a big, big difference for people. Research apparently done on those on the $1,200 checks saw that most people spent their checks on rent, food, and other essential bills. So this is going to be the biggest payment that people receive. Again, those people who are making over $80,000 through $100,000, they will not see this check. And
we should say too, they've done studies on how those payments affected state tax revenue too. And shockingly, I think the New York Times found that state tax revenue only on average dropped by around 2% or a little under 2% last year. And a lot of that had to do with these payments that were still going back into the economy. And then you also saw states like Florida without income tax really were harmed as well. But largely what it's, these states should be thrilled. What's helping keep their economy afloat are these payments that are going back out. To
a large extent, people, to the extent that, when people got the money, they went out and bought stuff. And that's where, a lot of the revenue is coming from. And so that's pretty huge. We also now, there's a big push. Again, the moderates, so-called moderates, the conservatives, I would call them, in the Democratic Party are going back and they're trying to get him to lower the extension of unemployment benefits, or the expansion, I should say, the federal expansion, right? Like you get your state unemployment benefits, and the last round of expansion of that was $300, was $600 in the CARES Act. The one passed in December was $300 per week. This has $400 per week until August of this year. And Joe Manchin wants it to be $300, of course, because he says, quote, I've been at $300. It's kind of hard to explain why you're getting a bump up now. Suggesting that the higher $400 figure would reduce incentives for people to rejoin the workforce, just as increasing vaccinations are poised to help the economy reopen. We want people to get back to work, Manchin said. It'd be awful for the doors to open up, and there's no one working. You got a lot of customers, no one working. That's the problem. This is just absurd. This is just absurd. Because first off, what would happen is if there was a smaller supply of workers, is that we know that pay would go up. And the idea, what should drive people back to work and drive people into stores should be their sense that they can go and spend their money and they can go and earn their money without risking their lives. The idea that once people get fully vaccinated, they're not going to want to come back to work. Well, there'll be other people who will want to take that work.
There are not enough people at the Johnny Rockets. People aren't going to want to spend money. What is that?
And we know that in the first couple of months of the pandemic, Congress passed a $600 weekly. So how do you justify going down to $300? Joe Manchin, but, Joe Manchin will Joe Manchin. The other thing that is developing, and we just don't know yet, we just don't know where these things are going to land. It's quite possible that money that is saved on the narrowing of the elimination of the $15 minimum wage and the narrowing of that threshold, that ramp down for folks who are making over $80,000 or did in 2019, could go into, and this is what's being pushed by at least 10 Democratic senators, automatic stabilizers. In other words, instead of saying we're going to provide these expansions in unemployment through August, or instead of actually putting any date on it, let's tag it, peg it to the number of unemployed in the country. So that if unemployment does not drop below a certain level, we don't have to come back and pass another bill. It just continues until unemployment drops to certain levels. That is also, they're trying to do this with all sorts of relief measures like SNAP. This was a problem even with the HEROES Act, frankly, that the House passed, that they did not include these automatic stabilizers. And these are unemployment insurance, any type of direct payments, anything like that. It would be pegged to how the economy is doing, which makes sense, right? I mean, that's presumably why you go back and provide more insurance. In the Great Recession, this is from a piece, Talking Points memo, making the point that Democratic lawmakers, a bunch of them, learned a lesson from then. The Great Recession, this is according to Don Bayer from Virginia on a panel last June, they re-upped unemployment insurance 13 different times. So every time you go to do that, you have to negotiate with either Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema, or the Republican Party, or frankly, Mark Warner or whomever in the Democratic Party. And the way you avoid that is you say, like, we're going to take it out of our hands. We know why we're providing this aid. It's because you have X number of millions of people unemployed. Well, if it drops below X number of million people, then we stop. And if it doesn't, then it just continues. So we'll see. I don't know if they will. I don't know if they'll be able to get that into the bill. We will see. But these are the big questions right now. But you should also know that there's something $60 billion, I think it was, for things like subsidies for childcare. And there's a lot of good things in this bill that I think we're going to see the benefits from. You know, the worst thing about the CARES Act was how much it waived. The problem wasn't so much that ordinary people, that the vast majority of people did not get the support they needed. It was very helpful in terms of dealing with poverty and keeping people above water. The problem was that everybody was driving under a yellow flag, but they whipped the green flag for corporations. So what ends up happening is, one of the fundamental problems with our economic system is that it creates massive wealth disparity. And that happened over the course of this pandemic, where you have billionaires making billions more dollars over the course of just this pandemic. Over the course of the past year, may have been the best year that Jeff Bezos ever had. Certainly probably was. And it's true of a bunch of other billionaires and multimillionaires. A lot of people made a ton of cash because corporations were basically told, we've got free money for you. We're going to backstop. You want to borrow money. You want to expand. You want to buy other things. You want to continue to amass concentrations of wealth and power. We got you covered. And that
the CARES Act basically socialized the stock market for the most part.
Indeed.
Yeah.
It, well, at least it socialized it in terms of what it provided a small number of people, but all the benefits are still privatized.
Yes, of course. That's I mean, the stock market is pretty much, for the most part, only accessed by elite people, and the benefits were seen by the very elite people. So quite American in that regard, in terms of at least the hierarchy. There's still tiers in the elites. So
child care centers in this bill will receive approximately $40 billion. Now, of course, they've been devastated in the way, because people were not sending their kids to childcare. But this is going to provide, this is going to go above and beyond for what to just maintain to keep these things from going out of business. I mean, this is going to be, this could have a significant influence on the provision of childcare in this country for low income people. So, I mean, I think there's going to be a lot of benefits that come out of this bill that we can't fully sort of like parse at the moment because it's massive. And we're talking about a massive amount of money. People got to remember that in that CARES Act, $2 trillion of that CARE Act, it was a $3 trillion bill. $2 trillion of that was actually just sort of a loaning provision that was backed up only by $500 billion that the Treasury Department had. So it earmarked $500 billion for the Treasury Department that essentially act as like, as capital reserves for the Fed to loan. So that money, that was not money that went out to people. This $1.9 trillion is going to end up in the hands of more Americans than any other bill that has passed at this point. And so it's going to be more widely distributed. And there's a $15 minimum wage, never mind in the context of COVID, it was well overdue 4 years ago, never mind today. And so the real issue with the $15 minimum wage, in my mind, has less to do with COVID and more to do with this was an opportunity, because I will go to my grave believing that Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema were not going to vote against the $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief bill because the $15 minimum wage was in there.
100%.
And, but we won't know in this instance. Maybe, who knows, pick up a couple of seats in 2022. I don't know what those seats will be.
I don't know. I mean, I think the fight for 15 continues next reconciliation bill.
Right. And there will be 2 more reconciliation bills, or there can be, over the next 2 years. So we will get a sense as to how that will happen. In New York State, and we'll keep you up to date on that, obviously, New York State, greater calls for Andrew Cuomo to resign. Protests throughout the state over the past day or two. And we will see. The investigation will begin on Cuomo, and we'll see if more women come out.
And he lost that fight where he tried to appoint someone very closely associated with his closest advisor to be the independent figure overseeing the investigation. I find it quite amusing. It reminds me of what actually the Washington football team did with their sexual harassment allegations, where they hired a lawyer paid by the owner to look into the sexual harassment allegations from inside the house. I mean, it's common practice in order to kind of quell PR concerns. And so we saw Cuomo try to get away with it. Tish James, New York Attorney General, said, I'm going to appoint someone myself. She has, I will say, just from a purely horse race political perspective, positioned herself quite nicely for a governor's run in 2022. First, by coming out ahead of Cuomo on these nursing home numbers, where she basically said that Cuomo had obscured the data and hidden the half of nursing home deaths that he did hide, allegedly. And then, of course, she's also going to be overseeing this investigation into the sexual harassment and assault allegations, really. I mean, the kissing forcibly is assault into Andrew Cuomo. And so, I think should someone like Cynthia Nixon not run again, I think Letitia James has set herself up quite nicely.
We'll see.